Today's scripture reading brings us to 1 Samuel chapter 27. This is a short chapter, only 12 verses, and I have it broken down into two sections. But I think it's important to understand what's going on, because David has now had this second encounter with Saul, and the second encounter was much like the first. The first one, Saul was very contrite, blamed himself after that encounter with David in the cave. And now Saul has come hunting him again after he said that he wouldn't. And I think at this point, David is just kind of broken. He's brokenhearted. He has been in hiding now and going through this for about 7+ years. And David is now just kind of very distraught. And we see in verse number 1, and David said in his heart, I shall now perish one day by the hand of Saul. There is nothing better for me than I should speedily escape into the land of the Philistines. And so now he's talking about going into the land of the Philistines once again. And I think that Psalm 13:1, now it doesn't say this, but I think Psalm 13:1 probably is explaining his mindset here. Psalm 13, it says this, How long wilt thou forget me, O Lord, forever? How long wilt thou hide thy face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long shall mine enemy be exalted over me? See, because David has now been in hiding for over 7 years. 7 years. But you see, whatever God has promised, he will perform. Now, he may not perform it in your time. He may not perform it when you feel like he should, but he will always perform it. And David at this point has just lost faith. He's lost confidence, and he's gotten very discouraged, and he's run out of patience, essentially, is kind of where it is. So he goes down to the Philistines, and he meets Achish of Gath. He's the king of Gath there. And in this few verses here, I have verses 1-7 titled, David Sojourns with the Philistines. He goes down there, and he's got his 600 men, and he's got his 2 wives, and he goes unto the king, and he sweet talks the king, and he says, verse number 5, and David said unto Achish, If I have now found grace in thine eyes, let them give me a place in some town in the country, that I may dwell there. For why should thy servant dwell in the royal city with thee? David he's like the king of humility, right? Now, I don't think it was put on. I think it's natural for David, for he is a man after God's own heart. So David is like, why should I dwell in the same city as you? You're the king and I'm nothing. So they give him Ziklag there, which was a property of Judah, but the Philistines were occupying it now, and it was on the border, I think, of Simeon and Judah, and there was kind of confusion between those two, but then it became Judah's property after this event. David and his men go set up shop there, and the Bible tells us that he is there for 1 year and 4 months. Now, the second part of this chapter begins in verse number 8, and that's verses 8-12, and I have that titled, David Lies but fulfills the command of God. Because David goes up and he goes into Ziklag, and it says here in verse number 8, David and his men went up and invaded the Gershurites and the Gezrites and the Amalekites. For those nations were of old the inhabitants of the land, as thou goest to Shur, even unto the land of Egypt. What that's saying is these people, the Geshurites and the Gezrites, they had been there for a long time. And in fact, if you were to go to Deuteronomy chapter 20, you would find that Moses, by the command of God, had told Joshua, when you go into the land, you spare no one. Not men, not women, not sucklings, not any of that. You kill them all. But what happened was they didn't. And because they didn't, those people would end up perverting the Israelites. And so when I said in the title that David lies, I'll get to that part in a second, but he fulfills the command of God. God had told Joshua to go and wipe out these inhabitants, but he didn't. David is going and doing that now. Now, whether he's doing it simply because he is trying to fulfill the command of God of old, probably not. There's nothing to suggest that. But he is fighting in this verse Israel's enemies, and the Philistines their friends. How I don't know, the term's skipping my brain right now, but they're compadres. Anyway, and then when I say David lies, is he goes down through here, he gets the spoils of war, he takes it to Achish, and Achish asks him, he says, whether have you made road today? Verse number 10, David said, against the south of Judah, and against the south of Jahemelites, and the south of the Kenites. All these are Israelites. David is telling this king of the Philistines, I have been going and fighting against my own people. That's what he's telling him. But in fact, he wasn't. He was going and fighting Israel's enemies and the allies. Hey, that's the word I was looking for. The Philistines' allies. He was fighting them. But he made sure to kill them all so no one could go and tell Achish what David was doing. And so at this point in time, it says here in verse number 12, and Achish believed David, saying, he hath made his people Israel utterly to abhor him, therefore he shall be my servant forever. Achish thought that David was killing his own people, and so his own people, they would never take David back. And Achish thought he had David, in the palm of his hand. But in fact, he just didn't know. Why? Because David lied. That is a sure sign. See, if you are walking by faith, you don't need to lie. And that's why David is kind of in a spiritual lull right here. He's hurting. And I can understand we've all been there. So let's not throw stones at David, right? We've all been there. But because of this, it caused David to do some things that were uncharacteristic of the nature of God and more characteristic of the nature of man. So that's going to be 1 Samuel chapter 27. I hope this has been some sort of help to you. God bless, and we'll look forward to seeing you next time.